She traveled 2,000 miles to be rejected, but the cowboy who found her changed everything. Clara Whitmore stepped down from the stagecoach into a cloud of dust that bit at her eyes like tiny needles. The letter crumpled in her gloved hand had promised salvation, a respectable marriage to Thomas Brennan, successful merchant of Redemption Creek. She smoothed her traveling dress, brown wool that had seen too many miles, and searched the crowd for kind eyes that might belong to her intended. A man in a pressed suit and polished boots approached, his gaze sweeping over her like she was livestock at auction. His face, clean-shaven and soft from indoor work, twisted into something between disgust and disappointment. "You the Whitmore woman?" "Yes, sir. Clara Whitmore." "You must be, I am Thomas Brennan." His voice carried the chill of winter wind. "And you are not what was promised." The words hit her harder than the Kansas sun. Clara's fingers tightened on her worn carpetbag, the leather handle slick with nervous sweat. Around them, the bustle of Main Street seemed to pause, as if the whole town was holding its breath to witness her humiliation. "The letter said you needed a wife." "Someone to, I need a lady, Miss Whitmore. Someone who can stand beside a man of standing in this community." His eyes traveled from her sun-darkened hands to her practical boots, finding fault with every detail. "You look like you've been working fields, not sitting in parlors." Heat flashed through Clara's chest, part shame, part fury. She had worked fields. Had kneaded bread at dawn and mended clothes by candlelight to scrape together the fair West. Had buried her parents in Pennsylvania soil and sold everything she owned chasing the hope in his carefully penned words. "I can cook and sew and keep house fine as any woman you'll find." Brennan stepped back as if she carried plague. "I'm sure you can. But I cannot afford to have my reputation questioned by association with." He gestured vaguely at her person. "This." The stagecoach driver finished unloading luggage, his weathered face carefully neutral. Other passengers climbed aboard for the next leg of their journey, their conversations a low murmur that might have been about her or might have been about the weather. Clara couldn't tell which was worse. "There's a boarding house on 2nd Street, Brennan said, already turning away. "Mrs. Henderson might have worked for someone of your background." He walked toward a gleaming buggy where a woman in silk and feathers waited, parasol raised against the afternoon sun. His real choice. His proper choice. Clara stood alone in the settling dust, 2,000 miles from anything she'd ever known, with $17 in her purse and nowhere to sleep when darkness fell. The letter slipped from her fingers and tumbled across the rutted street like tumbleweed, carrying her last hope with it into the shadows between buildings. 3 blocks later, her legs gave out. The boarding house had no room, the seamstress shop needed no help, and the saloon keeper had laughed when she asked about honest work. Now she crouched behind the general store in a narrow alley where the shadows cut sharp as knives, her back pressed against rough-hewn boards that still smelled of pine sap and hope. Her stomach clenched like a fist. The last meal she'd eaten was yesterday's stale biscuit on the stagecoach, and the $17 in her purse wouldn't stretch far enough to matter. Not in a town where strangers paid double and questions came free with every transaction. The sun was dying behind the western mountains, painting the sky the color of old blood. Soon the temperature would drop, and she had nowhere warm to spend the night. Clara closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's voice, but all she could hear was the wind whistling between buildings like a funeral hymn. Footsteps approached on the main street. Heavy boots, unhurried. She pressed deeper into the shadows, praying whoever it was would pass by without noticing the woman who'd become Redemption Creek's newest cautionary tale. The steps paused. Then turned into the alley. "Miss? You hurt?" The voice was rough as sandpaper but gentle as Sunday morning. Clara looked up to find a man silhouetted against the dying light, tall, lean, with shoulders that spoke of hard work and harder years. His hat brim cast shadows across his face, but she could see his eyes, dark and careful as a deer's. "I'm fine," she lied, trying to push herself upright. The world tilted sideways, and only his quick hands kept her from hitting the ground. "When's the last time you ate something?" His touch was steady, respectful, the kind of gentleness that came from handling injured animals and broken things. "Yesterday." "Maybe." The words slipped out before she could stop them. He studied her face in the fading light, and she saw something there she hadn't expected: recognition. Not of her specifically, but of the look she wore. The hollow-eyed desperation of someone who traveled too far on too little hope. "Name's Ezra Kane," he said, shrugging out of his coat. The wool still held his warmth when he settled it around her shoulders. "Got a place about 2 miles out. Ain't much, but there's soup on the stove and a fire in the hearth." Clara shook her head, even as her body swayed toward the promise of warmth. "I can't. People will talk. People talk anyway." He offered his arm, patient as stone. "Question is whether you freeze to death listening to them or get warm enough to care what they say tomorrow." Through the coat's fabric, she caught the scent of leather and wood smoke, of honest sweat and something else, soap, as if he'd taken care to wash before coming to town. As if he'd been planning to speak to someone who mattered. Clara woke the next morning to the smell of bacon sizzling in a cast iron pan and the sound of Ezra moving quietly around his small cabin. Morning light filtered through oiled paper windows, casting everything in honey-colored warmth that reminded her so sharply of home that her chest tightened like a wound reopening. She lay still on the narrow cot he'd given her, wrapped in quilts that smelled of lavender and wood smoke, and let the memories wash over her like flood water. Her mother's hands had moved the same way Ezra's did now, careful, economical, making much from little. Every morning for 23 years, Clara had woken to those sounds: the scrape of iron on iron, the pop and hiss of grease, her father's boots on the porch as he returned from milking. "Coffee's ready when you are," Ezra said softly, not turning around. Somehow he'd known she was awake. Through the single window, she could see his small ranch, a few head of cattle grazing in a pasture that needed mending, a barn that leaned like an old man tired of standing straight. It wasn't much, but it was honest work. The kind her father would have respected. "You remind me of him," she said without meaning to. Ezra glanced over his shoulder. "Who's that?" "My father. He had hands like yours. Good with broken things." She accepted the tin cup of coffee he offered, inhaling steam that carried hints of chicory and yesterday's bread. "Had a farm outside Philadelphia. Nothing grand, but we never went hungry." "What happened to it?" The question was gentle, but it still cut deep. Clara wrapped her fingers around the warm cup and stared into the dark liquid as if it might hold answers instead of pain. "Cholera took them both last spring. Mama first, then Papa 3 days later." The words came out flat, worn smooth by repetition. "Couldn't work the land alone, and the bank man came calling before they were cold in the ground." She could still see his face, round and soft as risen dough, but his eyes hard as winter. The papers he'd spread across her kitchen table like a death sentence, all official seals and careful script that added up to everything she'd ever known being sold to pay debt she hadn't known existed. "Sold everything I could. Paid what I could. Still wasn't enough." Clara took a sip of coffee and tasted salt she hadn't realized she was crying. Then Mr. Brennan's letter came. Pretty words about needing a wife, about building something together in the West. Seemed like Providence. Outside, a meadowlark called from the fence post, its song sweet and wild and heartbreaking. Clara closed her eyes and heard her mother humming the same tune while kneading bread, flour dusting her apron like snow. A shadow passed by the window. Too quick. Too quiet. The shadow resolved into boots on the porch steps, heavy, deliberate, the kind that announced authority before their owner ever spoke a word. Ezra's hand moved to the rifle above the door, then stopped as 3 sharp knocks echoed through the small cabin like gunshots. "Ezra Kane. Open up." Clara's coffee cup rattled against her teeth. She recognized that voice from town yesterday, Sheriff Caldwell, the man who'd watched her humiliation with eyes like winter stones and said nothing to help. Ezra opened the door just wide enough to fill the frame with his shoulders. "Sheriff. Early for a social call. This ain't social." Caldwell's voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Mind if I come in?" "Actually, I do." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Clara set down her cup and stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that wanted to shake. Through the gap beside Ezra's arm, she caught a glimpse of the sheriff, thick-set and graying, with a star pinned to his vest and suspicion carved deep into the lines around his eyes. "That the Whitmore woman in there?" "Miss Whitmore is my guest." "Your guest?" Caldwell's laugh held no humor. "That what we're calling it? Man harbors a strange woman overnight, decent folks start asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that wonder what business a unmarried woman has staying at a bachelor's ranch. The kind that wonder if maybe she came west for reasons other than what she claimed." Heat flashed through Clara's chest. She stepped into view beside Ezra, lifting her chin despite the tremor in her voice. "I came here to marry Thomas Brennan. He chose otherwise. That's the whole truth of it." Caldwell's gaze swept over her like she was evidence in a crime he hadn't solved yet. "Brennan says you misrepresented yourself in your letters. Says you seemed familiar with certain unsavory behaviors." The accusation hit her like a physical blow. Clara's breath caught, and beside her, Ezra went very still. "That's a lie," she whispered. "Maybe. Maybe not." Caldwell shifted his weight, hand resting casual-like on his gun belt. "Point is, this town's got a reputation to maintain. We don't harbor women of questionable character, and we don't tolerate men who enable them." "What exactly are you saying, Sheriff?" Ezra's voice had gone quiet and dangerous. "I'm saying Miss Whitmore here's got 3 days to prove she belongs in Redemption Creek. Find respectable work, respectable lodging, and respectable references. Otherwise, she'll be on the next stage out, and you'll be answering some uncomfortable questions about harboring undesirables." Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. 3 days. In a town where decent women crossed the street to avoid her and decent men looked through her like she was smoke. "And if I can't?" Caldwell's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Then you'll discover that vagrancy's a crime in these parts. Crime that comes with consequences." He touched his hat brim in mock courtesy and walked away, his boots echoing against the porch boards like a countdown to Judgment Day. After the sheriff disappeared down the dusty trail, Clara sank into the chair by the window, her hands folded tight in her lap to stop their shaking. Ezra stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the dust settle where Caldwell's horse had been. "He's wrong about you," he said finally. "Is he?" Clara stared out at the morning light painting the mountains gold. "Man like Brennan doesn't spread lies unless they serve him somehow. Question is what he gains by ruining a woman he already threw away." Ezra closed the door and turned to face her. In the gentle light, she could see the lines around his eyes, the careful way he held himself, as if he'd learned to expect disappointment and prepare for it. Maybe he's just the kind of man who can't stand being wrong. Easier to paint you wicked than admit he judged poorly. Clara stood and walked to the stove, where the bacon had grown cold in its grease. With practiced movements, she began cleaning the pan, her hands finding comfort in familiar work. 3 days, she murmured. Not enough time to prove anything, even if folks were inclined to listen. Then don't prove anything. Ezra's voice was quiet but firm. Just be who you are. Let that be enough. But as Clara scrubbed the cast iron clean, she wondered if who she was, a woman with dirt under her nails and grief in her heart, would ever be enough for a place like Redemption Creek. Or if kindness like Ezra's was just another kind of promise that would crumble when tested by the weight of what others expected. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of coming weather and the distant sound of church bells calling the righteous to Sunday service.